Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Shakespearean Shrew. I am your Shakespearean Shrew, Karen Viner, lover of all things Bard. All the things. So, this is a Decorum Be Down podcast, and we are going to be understanding Shakespeare's stages and all the players on it. And today, we have a very special guest that I'm very excited about. We have Michaela McCall, who is an ASL interpreter. You're in your junior year, I believe, right?
Yes.
I'm gonna get the letters in the right order. OCU.
Yes.
Here in Oklahoma, and it's a topic that one of my listeners actually brought up after I had done an episode in Korea.
I listened to that actually. Yeah.
And so they were like, I mean, if it's hard to translate from early modern English to Korean, what is that like for ASL
Absolutely.
individuals, and how does that translate? And I was like, that's a brilliant question. And then I came looking for you.
And you found me.
And I found you. And so we're really excited to have you here. How did you get started as an ASL interpreter?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So I started learning ASL on my own whenever I was a child. I think I saw it on TV and it just struck my interest, and I had access to the internet, as most children of my generation did, so I went online and started looking up signs and just kind of dabbled in it on my own. And then when I was in high school, I was actually homeschooled, but I still needed a foreign language. And I met deaf community members who were willing to teach me just kind of kitchen table style. And so I did that through high school to fulfill my language credit. And one day I came in for my ASL lesson with my teacher, Robin Riccardi, who's just fantastic. And she slid a paper across the table to me that had the interpreting degree sheet for OSU OKC. And she was like, this is what you should do. And I thought about it, and I was like, you know what, you're right, because I love this language, I love playing with it, I love the deaf community, and so I went to school for it. I got my first degree in sign language in 2022, and then I got my degree in sign language interpreting in at the beginning of 2024, so this year. And I got my state certification in, I believe, April.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So I think it's such an important thing, because I have friends that are in the deaf community, and I think it can be isolating often.
Yeah.
So in terms of the population, and I might be off because this was from actually a student's paper, but I think they said it was something like 1.3% of the population is deaf or significantly hearing impaired.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact statistic. It's one I learned in school, but I think that sounds right. Yeah, of the whole population.
Right. And they made an interesting point, because they talked about the fact that it seems like such a small number, but when you actually think about how many people that is, it becomes much bigger.
Definitely.
And so I always loved that number, because it does seem so small, but at the same time, if we just look at that number, I don't think it does justice to the amount of people in our communities, and how embracing it can be to try.
Yes.
Even though I will admit, I will try today, and I might fail. So one of my friends, her name is BK, and she was telling me about her husband, because her husband knows sign language, but apparently there are faux pas. So they were out bowling. BK, this story's for you. And he was trying to say that he was very hungry, because they were all ready to go. And so he starts, hungry, I think she said, is this.
Yeah, hungry is once.
And then, but he starts doing this, which apparently means horny.
Yes, it does.
So he was, and I was like, well, that actually makes perfect sense. He's really hungry. It's a different kind of hungry.
Absolutely.
But so she told me about this, and I was like, oh boy. So But I think it's like any other language. I love languages. I love learning new languages, but you are going to sound like an idiot.
It happens.
No matter what, when you learn a new language.
Yeah.
And you just have to kind of embrace the fuck-ups and the feeling like an idiot in order to kind of get past that.
Oh yeah, you can't be afraid to fail because it's part of learning. So you absolutely have to just allow yourself to make mistakes, even if they are telling a whole room that you're horny when you probably aren't.
I love that story. I was like, oh boy, Zach, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, there's a couple that I love that are like, we can curse on this podcast.
Yes.
Is that true?
Mm-hmm.
If you bring your fingertips to your chin and extend them, it's thank you. If you start from under your chin, it's fuck you. And my other favorite one is if you take your index finger, I'm trying to think for podcast listeners how this will make sense. It might not.
That's okay, it's on YouTube as well.
Okay, perfect. So then you'll have to watch it to see this sign. But this is automatic. This is condom.
Oh!
So really strange that those two words are very similar in sign language.
So get a little uncomfortable. Get out of your comfort zone and try different things. Now, I do have to ask, because obviously you are very good at signing at this point in your journey. So with other languages, when I get pretty familiar, and especially when I'm in a community where we're using a language a lot, I'll start dreaming in it.
Yeah.
So do you have that? Like,
I
do
do.
You sign in your dreams?
It was a very exciting night when I had my first dream in sign language, where I was actually using it, and I think it was I was in school for it at the time, and so I was in my sign language classroom in my dream with my professor, who's deaf. All of our professors were deaf at OSU OKC. And I remember having a lecture and doing a test in sign language and talking about it with my classmates in sign language in my dream. And the next day I went to class and I was like, you will never believe this! So yeah, I dream it, and sometimes I can think in it. Or you can switch, kind of, because you can almost feel your hands moving in your head. It's really strange.
I love that. So what have you signed for?
So I've done all kinds of different things. My favorites have been graduations and concerts, because since I am studying theater, I love attention. I love being on stage. So graduations, concerts, I've done some, sometimes you're in a classroom, sometimes you're in a doctor's office, so you kind of go all over with it. But my favorite is performance.
Oh my gosh. I can totally see you. I've seen those interpreters at concerts.
Oh yeah.
Just badasses who are like signing and rocking out.
Yes.
I'm just like watching them instead of the concert, because I'm like, this is so much more entertaining.
So good. I love it. It makes my heart happy. When I go to concerts, I always try and sit where I can see the accessible section so that I can see because sometimes I'll be watching and I'm like, how would I interpret that? And is it the same, or did they have a different way that I never would have thought of before? So.
Oh, that's a really good point.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of different ways, or
well, they say it's an art and a science, because you have kind of this linguistic and cultural thing you're working with, but also, language is so malleable that everybody is going to have a little bit of a different way to sign things. So that's what keeps it interesting.
It's so interesting that sign came out in the 17th century. And so I think the first instance was a wedding in, oh gosh, what year was it? I want to say 1635 was the first actual recorded.
I'll have to believe you.
Recorded time that they were signing. And I thought that was so interesting because it equates to when English started becoming structured.
Yeah.
Because before Shakespeare, every different, not just because of Shakespeare, just to clarify, but before that time period, every different county had a completely different English.
Right. It hadn't been unified yet.
Right. And so they would say words, and if you were in one group and talked in another county, you were like, I have no idea what you're saying.
Right.
So these two languages emerged and actually grew structure at around the same time, which I thought was very cool. So when you're talking about British Sign Language and American Sign Language, is that also something that has to be considered when you're thinking about
So British Sign Language and American Sign Language function as two completely separate languages. They actually developed linguistically, like their linguistic history is completely different, because American Sign Language is derived from French Sign Language, not English. So what happened was, a quick, brief history lesson. Thomas Gallaudet, which the deaf university here in the States is named after, Gallaudet University, he traveled to France and he met Laurent Clerc, who is a deaf professor at a university in France, and he was teaching French Sign Language, or LSF they call it. And then it was when Gallaudet met him that he was like, I want to bring sign language to the US. So Gallaudet is an English speaker who doesn't know any sign language, and Clerc is a French sign language user who's deaf. And they get on a boat together, and they sail to the US, and on that boat, they taught each other their languages.
Wow.
And that is how we got American Sign Language, and they founded schools and universities in I believe it's in Connecticut. That's something I should know, but I believe it's in Connecticut. It's in New England. And so our language that developed here in the States has a French grammar structure and a French syntax, and is pulled from that, and we have a single-handed alphabet, so all of your letters can be done on one hand. But British Sign Language developed independently in the UK, so they have a completely different syntax, grammar, and alphabet system, even though they're both English-based.
I find this fascinating. I'm like, I want to write a paper. This is so interesting. So, as you're thinking about signing for something like a Shakespeare production, I sent you off to do a task.
You did.
I brought my Shakespearean insults mug with me. And so I asked you about insults in, some of Shakespeare's greatest insults. And you mentioned that some of them would be pretty
difficult, yes,
to sign. And I was really intrigued because what makes it so difficult? Because I think that'll answer a lot about what makes interpreting Shakespeare so difficult.
Yes. So it's funny, things are difficult for different reasons. Sometimes it's because Shakespeare's insults that we're seeing in these plays are so ancient that it's like, okay, I need to research what this word is and why it's being used in this context and what it meant then and what it means now to begin to understand it so I can find a physical alternative. Some of the insults are really easy though, because if there's visual, then it's like, oh my gosh, foot liquor?
Yes.
Like, that's so easy. You just spell foot and you, right? Like, and some of them are better in sign language than they are in English. You mentioned one, and I remember it in sign language, and now I don't remember what the English version was. The earwax. Do you know that off the top of your head?
Yes.
It's in your head. There is no brain. There's earwax.
No brain. There's more earwax.
Yeah. So that's great. I was thinking, and at first I said, what would that be in sign language? But if you take it really literally, it works because you can just take the head off, open it. Look in. Brain? No. Earwax. Ugh. Like, and you can just
not so much brain as earwax.
There you go. Yeah. So you can just and you can just show it. And so some of them make, but yeah, there's some that I just like. It's a head scratcher. And that's one thing about the interpreting community is it is a community. So a lot of times, we have group chats and email chains full of, okay, this thing came up in this assignment, how would you sign it? And everybody sends videos back and forth going, do you want to try it this way or does this way make more sense? And so, yeah, sometimes it's just context, and ASL is a visual language and English is not.
Yes.
And so how do you make something spoken or something that's conceptual, how do you make it visual can be really difficult.
Well, and just watching you with those few curses, the theatricality of it.
Yes.
I love it. It was another one where I was like, I would just be watching you the whole time instead of watching the play. I'd have to watch the play twice.
Right.
But it's kind of a perfect combination of the things you love, because as you were doing it, I was like, oh, this is a performance. Okay, cool. Like,
yeah,
that works.
Super. It's very expressive. And whenever you learn about kind of how ASL, what the language, if you dive into the language and see the different components, you see pantomime, you see performance, you see nonverbal communications and gestures mixed in with language and grammar and syntax. So it is very performative, and we really rely on facial expressions and point of view to give context and tone to what the signs are.
Yes.
So,
I was going to ask that question. It was on my list, but then as you made that face when you were
said,
like, and I was like, oh, got it. Like, that's where that tone comes in to get those.
Well, and I was
across.
thinking about it as I was kind of thinking about some of the things that we would be talking about today. And I just finished. I took a semester of a Shakespeare acting class this fall. And one of my classmates had this scene with Macbeth and Lady M when he says for the first time that he doesn't want to kill the king, and she's like, "What do you mean?" And there's a line where Lady M says, "We fail." In some versions, there's a question mark, and some there's not. And so our actor got to kind of choose, am I asking a question? Am I saying a statement? What does that look like? And I was thinking, oh my gosh, interpreting, no matter how much prep you do ahead of time, you're constantly listening to the actors. Because if Lady M says it as a question and not as a statement, that's absolutely going to change how I interpret it and what my face does. And so it's really interesting whenever you listen to, you know the tone that's in your head, but the tone that comes out of the actor's mouth will change what you do.
So for most performances, would you attend the performance, like the dress rehearsal or something of that
if you
sort
can,
to get,
sometimes
so that you're not guessing on the
right. Sometimes you get sometimes those jobs come out night of. Maybe they have like a deaf audience member and they pull an interpreter as soon as you can, and you just do your best. Sometimes you just get the script ahead of time. But in a perfect world, you'd be able to go to one run through and kind of watch. But otherwise, I mean, interpreters, it's what we do. So we're really good at on the fly, just listening at the same time while we're thinking and producing signs. I mean, you just get good at it eventually.
So it almost sounds like improv.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, because if you think about it, day to day, interpreters are interpreting real life conversations where you don't know what's going to come out of the person's mouth next. So you get very good at improv.
Very nice. So is this something that has become more prevalent, do you think? Have you noticed that more concerts, more performances are adding accessibility to their performances?
I would say it is becoming easier to make it accessible. I don't know if it's I would say yes overall. However, there's so much nuance to it, and there are still barriers that we're working on overcoming. But I would say, as a whole, over the last 20 years or so, we have seen a huge leap in accessibility. In the term of interpreters being more available, more affordable, easier to get a hold of, but also captions and other accessibility devices are becoming much more widespread.
That's a good point. I mean, I bitch about AI as much as I can, but
so do I.
That is probably a good benefit of AI.
Yeah. Our captioning technology has become, it still has a long way to go, trust me. But it's become a lot, being able to get the accessibility measures necessary has become easier over time. Especially thanks to the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, was signed in 1990 or 1991. But that takes, big things like that take decades to really, really infiltrate society. And so I think we're starting to see it being implemented in ways we didn't know how to do before. So that's a plus side, I would say.
Definitely. All right. I'll give AI the day off and we won't bitch about it today. So when we're talking about, we've talked about tone, you've kind of mentioned some of the difficulties in terms of word choice. Because if you're talking about things, I don't know how often boils come up into conversation, or some of the different kinds of language. How do you go about dealing with language that you don't have? Do you just find the closest approximation?
It kind of depends. You mentioned boils and things like that, where if it's a word we don't always use, but something that conceptually we know what it means, you just get real descriptive with it. That's what's great about a visual language, is red, right? It's gross. That's really what you need to know. But sometimes it takes a lot of research. So especially with the words we use in Shakespeare's plays, I'll go through and it's a word I've never seen before. I didn't even know how to pronounce. One's in, I don't remember what scene they were doing, but somebody said zoons. I said,
yes.
What the hell is zoons? And it's a short approximation of God's wounds.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's something I would have had to look up. But then once you look it up and you understand what the context is, you go, well, it's an exclamation. I mean, you could just go, holy shit. I mean, it's just some type of exclamation. So sometimes it's just a matter of finding the word and its etymology and knowing what it means and having a word that's very similar. But sometimes it's cultural context of Shakespeare's world that we don't even have, and so you just kind of have to do your best on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes you have to expand on it and describe it. Sometimes you find a word that's really close, and then you can swap it out for something else. There's a lot of different techniques on how, or you can use an opposite. So if it might not be this word, but you can say, well, it's not this other thing. I should have pulled examples. It's so hard to talk about it, like, conceptually, but yeah.
So how about timing? Because if you do have to be more descriptive, it'll probably take more signs in order to... So how does that work while you're trying to sync up with the performers on stage and what they're doing and who's speaking? How do you kind of stick with that and adjust accordingly?
Yeah, so... each interpreter is a little bit different, but there's you always will have a little bit of lag time. And there's been all kinds of research on what the best lag time is for spoken language, because you're having your auditory processing and your cognitive processing, and then what it takes to actually... So there's like, I think it's like a 3.5 second delay or something like that. In sign language, it's a little bit different because you don't have your own voice over top of the auditory, because it's English to sign. So, but you do want to have a little bit of a lag. So everybody that's watching the interpretation is going to be a few seconds behind. And yeah, if you have to expand and really describe something, you better be listening ahead so that you can catch yourself up eventually. And sometimes that means expanding in one spot and truncating in another so that you can kind of keep pace. There are some things that are actually shorter and make more sense in ASL than they do in English, where you may take a whole sentence to say it. I can do it in one sign, or I can do it in a look. So in English, if you want to say, what are you doing? I might just go, right? So you kind of have to, it's almost like you're playing chess with the language to make sure that you're always in a good time frame. And if there's something really important action-wise happening on stage, I might not sign anything until it's done so that I can redirect their attention to the actors. Because the worst thing is if they're watching me and they miss something happening on stage, because then they're still just as left out as if I was never there.
I mean, that makes perfect sense, because I was going to say I'd have to come twice, because I like that that one performance I just would want to watch and see you sign. But so that definitely makes sense in terms of knowing where to turn the focus and how to, knowing when to step in and when to kind of step back.
Absolutely.
And let so many different nuanced elements. So rhythm is, as you know, a huge part of Shakespeare. And as we just talked about with signing at concerts, it can be a huge, amazing thing. I love watching people sign at concerts. But concerts, I think, are a little bit different because you can feel the beat. How do you convey that rhythm, or is that just something that you don't worry as much about in terms of signs? So for Shakespeare, it can be tough to maintain the verse lines, the iambic pentameter of it, because just the grammar is so different that a lot of times you lose that. But things like rhyme or double entendre, those you can play with a lot. And there's even some times where you keep the rhythm when you can, and you nix it if you have to, because what's most important is that it's understood. Right. But things like Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo?
wherefore in sign language, we have a sign for why, but we also have another version which is 4/4, and it means why. And so in that instance, it's great because we have 4/4, which has the same rhythm as wherefore, and it means the same thing. So sometimes you find something like that and you go, oh, that's so nice, it matches. But sometimes you really have to do so much reshaping that the rhythm is a little lost.
So, when we're talking about what they get from it, because so when I was talking to the translator in South Korea, Charles, what he said was so fascinating because he was like, half the time, the people who are reading the Korean are laughing at jokes because they get it better than the people who are listening to the early modern English, because early modern English, even for people who are English speakers, can be difficult.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if that same kind of thing happens sometimes where the jokes and the comedy, especially because Shakespeare tends to make a lot of dick jokes.
Yes.
If it translates, in a sense, easier.
Yeah, sometimes it does, especially because an interpreter who's done a lot of research on the show, they're going to make sure that the implied meanings are explicit so that the audience can be clued in on that. So sometimes we'll push it a little bit more to make it even more clear than the actors might be doing on stage with the early modern English. So yeah, sometimes it makes more sense, especially Shakespeare. As I had a conversation with a professor where I said Shakespearean English is a visual language just as much as it's a spoken one because of the poetry and the metaphor. And I'm like, that makes more sense on my hands than it does coming out of my mouth, because you can see Juliet smell the flower and know that it's the same. And you almost, as you watch it, you almost can go, it makes more sense than it would have if I just listened to it. And especially, not every audience is, familiar with Shakespeare and its language. And when you're in a 4-hour show, sometimes I'm sure they're sitting there just as lost as if I wasn't there for a deaf individual, right? So, yeah.
Yes. Speaking on behalf of my significant other.
Yeah.
It's okay. He's pretty.
He's pretty.
Okay, so what do you think are the most helpful things that people can do to make their communities more inclusive, especially for the ASL community?
Provide interpreters. Yeah, and interpreters, easily accessible interpreters, having them there for if it's big public events, having one there already if you're doing, like if it's a performance or if it's a speech or a community event where people are all going to be have interpreters and advertise this is interpreted. So then that just takes a little bit of the pressure off of the deaf community to try and advocate for themselves and fight for themselves. Captions on everything is my friends and my family are so tired of hearing me go into a place and I'll go, that's not captioned. There's not captions on that. Why aren't there captions? And then just I feel like awareness is just one thing that's so important, because I'm going to contradict myself a little bit. As important as interpreters are, it's also important to just know, like, you can interact with this community on your own easily, whether you know sign language or not. I mean, there's so many ways that you can communicate and try and find a way to make a connection that I just think if people try, if you are aware of these people and are not, so many people are still scared of people that are different.
Yes.
And it's kind of a subconscious thing in our culture to be that way, but there's no need for it, because so many of, like, the most colorful people and the people with the brightest personalities that are funny are the deaf people that I've met through my career. And I'm like, oh, if all of my friends knew you, this would be great. So having a seat at the table for them and knowing that they're just like everybody else, I think is important.
Yes. I mean, for me, it's just about awareness. Because, like I said, with my friend, I feel like I just need to make sure that 5 of us aren't talking at the same time, right, so that she can see whoever is talking. Because as long as she can see the person talking, she really has no problem kind of keeping up with the conversation. If we all start talking to her at the same time,
who do I look at?
Exactly. Yeah. So definitely stuff like that. And then, are there any signs that you think are things that we can learn that would be pretty easy and just kind of inclusive?
Yeah, like just regular signs, not
just
Shakespeare.
regular signs.
I love "Hi, nice to meet you." That's my go-to. It's always just a wave, and then "nice to meet you."
Okay.
So I love that.
That's a good one.
And then "Hi, nice to meet you." Thank you. We've already talked about. You can do it one-handed or both-handed.
Just remember.
Yeah,
here
above
and
the
not,
chin,
not
my
under the
friends.
chin.
And then "How are you?" And you just raise your eyebrows to make the question mark. How are you? And then I always like to say, "You're beautiful." That's a good way to start. "Oh, you're so beautiful." So those are kind of just your fun. That's just like you can start a conversation and it will just take off after that. If you come in and you, especially the deaf community, they love when people just try. So even just "How are you?" can just make a connection instantly and it can brighten somebody's day.
Well, and I think that's the same thing about so many communities, that people are they're so scared to try, and I think it comes back to the innate fear of failure or looking like an idiot.
Yeah.
But just embrace it.
Embrace it.
I do it all the time. And so I think that, if we can get past that and try, like you keep saying, I think that's one of the biggest things. Okay.
Absolutely.
So now, how about some Shakespeare?
Some Shakespeare. So I was thinking long and hard about what I wanted to show, and there is a version of Romeo and Juliet that was done by the Public Theater in 2020 during the pandemic. This was over Zoom. They performed the balcony scene completely in sign language. It was 2 deaf actors that translated their own versions. And I loved it, and I just thought it was really fun. So I just want to show a couple lines of Juliet's monologue, which I've mentioned several times. "Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou?" I just want to show a couple of that. I can't speak it and do it at the same time. It's like trying to pat my head.
No, that is completely.
So, but you'll be able to follow just because it's such a beautiful version of it. So I just want to show you.
Yes, please. I mean, I already had an inkling based on what scene you were talking about, but I knew exactly what you were saying.
Yeah.
Just because of your facial expressions, the gestures. I mean, that was just such again, the performative aspect of it is so clear and so cool to watch. That was awesome.
Thank you. I thought that one was fun, especially I watched that version, and when she spelled it in there, I was like, everybody knows what that means, so I thought that was kind of a cute way to do it, because she says it 3 different times, Anyway.
Yeah. I watched All the World's a Stage sign, and I showed my students that last year when we were doing As You Like It.
Yeah.
Because I was just like, what a different way to understand the importance of performance.
Yeah. There's also so many ways that they do, there's like a National Deaf Theater, and there's a Deaf Theater in Austin. If you watch this summer, Cinderella came through here, and they did it like an ASL English Cinderella, where half of the actors were all using sign language. They were all deaf. And so I would love to see in the future more things happen on stage where it's not just actors that are all using English and then an interpreter sitting at a table with a script. I'd love to see more shadowing interpretation where the actors are on stage, but then interpreters are behind them in black doing the blocking with them and signing right next to them and behind them. I just think that if we brought that to Oklahoma, that would be so cool.
I mean, what an interesting thing to try, especially maybe with some of the smaller performances where it's maybe even a one-person show where you could really...
I would love it, because right now the kind of general consensus in the hearing world for interpreters is to put them to the side as far off as they can so they're not distracting and nobody that doesn't have to look at them will. But I don't understand that. I'm
Right.
like, why don't we want the language front and center? So I love the idea of incorporated interpretations, or just having all the languages kind of blend together. And sometimes a scene might be in English, but sometimes maybe what if it's in sign language and then the English is appearing overhead? Or if one character is interpreting for another character. I just would love to... My dream in the future is to bring more of that onto the stage front and center, where people are actually seeing it happen.
And I think it's such a beautiful language that I mean, yes, it might have people watching the interpreter, but I feel like that's every production where I never know who I'm going to be looking at, because there's so many different people either on stage or just off stage where, you know, you're watching their facial expressions, you're watching this, that, or the other thing, and that's what makes performance so interesting.
Yeah.
Because, you know, Michelle and I often go to the same show, we sit right next to each other and watch a performance, but what we see from that performance can differ depending on what our interests are, or what, you know, our focus gets driven by, because who knows, maybe there's a really attractive character and I'm like, well, I'm watching you
the whole show. Yeah, well, that's part theater and artists. This is something that's important for artists to remind ourselves, is that it's for the audience. Yes. As much as it's for us, I mean, it's for them. And so they're just as much driving the story with their perspective of it as we are with what we're doing on stage. So yeah, I mean, you get to pick. And I think if interpretations are part of the performance, you're still not missing anything.
Right.
Because it's part of what the experience we're giving the audience is.
And I think if we can make ASL more of just a part of performances, part of the everyday, and not the exception, I think that changes how a lot of people would view the community. Because I think, like you said, there's uncertainty, there's fear, and so the more we can bring, you know, like you said, you started on this journey because you stumbled upon it when you were a kid. How many kids could we expose to the understanding that there are other languages, there are other communities, there are, you know, other people in this world besides themselves?
Yeah.
And why would that ever be a bad thing?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we were talking about awareness before, and what better way to bring awareness than to show it front and center. And then, when kids see it and they wonder, I mean, we might have more interpreters that way, which we need, especially in Oklahoma. We need more interpreters. So
I can't imagine why it's especially in Oklahoma.
Right.
But, okay.
Yeah.
Weird. But yeah, and I think, I mean, I love you, Oklahoma, I really do, but we have to stop being so afraid of things that are different.
Absolutely.
And I think that this has shown people how beautiful ASL is, and, you know, what we're missing when we don't get to see it.
Yeah. Oh, I agree 100%.
So, I'm so grateful for you coming on the show. And, okay, so you're going to sign my outro.
Yes.
Which I'm very excited about. So, all right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And just remember, everybody, all the world's a stage, and you too can be a shrew.
A shrew!